Well, I was born in Budapest, right in the middle of the Second World War. My mother originally came from Budapest, but she and my father were living and working in a town in Hungarian called Sobotka, but after the First World War it became part of Yugoslavia and was called Subotica. My father's uncle had a cement products factory there, and that's where they were working, and Mum went home to Budapest for my birth. 1942, the middle of the Second World War. My great-grandfather was a policeman in a provincial town in Hungary, which was unusual for a Jewish person to hold a public post like that, but he quite distinguished himself in that position. He had 5 children, the youngest of whom was or became my grandfather, and he became a cantor in the synagogue. A cantor is kind of like what we would call a worship leader, an assistant pastor, whatever. He moved to a town which, again, at the time he did it was in Hungary, but subsequently became Czechoslovakia, and I think it then became the Czech Republic, and I think now is Czechia, is it? I can't remember. But it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire originally. So my father was therefore born in Hungary. My father was born there to a town in Hungarian called Bastat Bánya, but in Czechoslovakian or whatever it's called Banska Bystrica, which is still there. So my father was born in Hungary, but he was born in 1905, and after the First World War that became part of Czechoslovakia, so he became a Czech citizen. His mother came from a family of 4 or 5 children. I think his mother was the oldest sister. She had one younger sister. The younger sister married a chap who lived in Budapest, and the 2 sisters got together, decided their kids should marry. First cousin marriages were not uncommon in the Jewish community in those days and places. So my father, who was the second oldest boy, married my mother, who was by far the youngest of 3 children of her parents. And in fact, her older brother married my father's sister. So there was that family collection then. I said Dad was the second oldest, but cantors don't make that much money. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. So his aunt and uncle were childless, and as I say, ran this cement products factory in Sobotka, or it was Sobotka then became Subotica after the First World War. So my father, at the age of 13, and his older brother, who was a year or so older, the 2 of them were sent to be with their uncle and aunt at that age to take the pressure off the family back home. So Dad grew up there and worked for his uncle who had brought him up. Now, of the relatives I've just mentioned, Dad's older brother, with whom he was sent there, he perished during the war. He was staying with my maternal grandparents there in Budapest, and he got sent out to the shops, I don't know, I think to buy some eggs or something. and he never came back. My great uncle and great aunt in Sobotka, they perished in Auschwitz, and that it's jumping around a little, I know. Dad was sent on forced labour. When the gang of forced labourers got to the point that they were too starved and too exhausted to do any work, or any more work, they were sent to the Mauthausen concentration camp for extermination. My mother's older brother, who had married my father's younger sister, he also perished in that in one of the outlying camps associated with that, and my father barely survived it. It was liberated by the Americans on the 5th of May 1945. Dad was sick to the point that he was actually already unconscious when the Americans came and liberated the camp. I believe Mauthausen was the last of the major concentration camps to be liberated as the Allies swept through Europe. The Americans had set up field hospitals to treat the inmates of those camps. A lot of the people who were still alive at the time of liberation were far from well, very, very ill indeed, as was my father. And the Americans did a lot to save these people. They didn't save them all, unfortunately. A lot of them still died, but fortunately Dad didn't. In the meantime, we were living, as I said, in Sobotka or Subotica. The Nazis evicted all the Jewish people out of their homes and put us all into a ghetto, from where we were transported by train, you know, the trains of cattle trucks you see in all the movies and photographs, to Auschwitz concentration camp for extermination. And now among the family members was my mother's cousin and her parents. She incidentally was the last of her generation, and she only died less than a year ago at the age of 96. But she was only a young girl then. She was 21, I think, and her parents, and her father was my mother's uncle. And my mother was pregnant with my brother and myself. I was 2 years old, and the uncle and aunt who had owned the cement products factory were all waiting to be boarded onto a train to Auschwitz. And I'm not quite sure why we changed queues to go to a different train. My mother did tell a story which I can't quite remember, but I think she said that there was an elderly gentleman who was blind and who was in great distress and calling out for help, and she went to his aid, and he was in a different line, and my mother and her uncle and aunt and cousin came with her and myself. The uncle and aunt, they didn't change queues, so they got onto the train which we were all going to originally get onto, and they perished in Auschwitz. The train we were on was on its way to Auschwitz, and it couldn't proceed because the bridge it was about to pass over, or passing over or something, it had been bombed. There was a lot of criticism of the Allies that they did not do more to bomb the railway lines leading to the concentration camps, because had they done so, a lot of people would have been saved, as we were, because the railway line was bombed. So they diverted the train and sent us to a forced labour camp in Austria, just south of a village called Vierhofen, between Vierhofen and St. Polten, and not that far from Mauthausen. But my mother had no idea that that my father was in Mauthausen. They had no idea where each other was or whether they were still alive. As I said, she was pregnant with my brother. There was a doctor in the camp who, in October 1944, delivered my brother. The trouble was that my mother had nothing, nothing for the baby. No nappies, no bottles, no baby clothes, no nothing. Now the camp was run by some old chap who considered himself a Nazi and strutted round, but I don't think he actually amounted to much. There were two guards who were basically older Austrians who were too old to be sent off to fight, so they were given the job of being guards, and they weren't bad people. Every so often the SS came and visited the camp, and they were bad people. But one of these guards, elderly guard, a man by the name of Losleben, he was aware of my mother's plight. He had a son who was in the army, and he got his son to visit my grandparents in Budapest and get some stuff for the baby, which the son then gave to his father, who was a guard in the camp, who smuggled it bit by bit to my mother. And that really is something, and I only wish that I could be in touch with his descendants to thank them, because the reality is that if either Losleben or his son would have been caught doing what they were doing, they would have been shot. But without them doing that, my brother would not have survived, and who knows about the rest of us. At any rate, this was in, he was born in October 1944, which was getting towards the end of the war. And as the Allies advanced, so the Germans were evacuating those camps and pushing the people back, sending them to concentration camps for extermination. And this same chap, Losleben, in the first few days of April 1945, warned my mother and said, "Get out of here, escape." It wasn't hard to escape. It wasn't a high security camp, but people on the whole didn't escape because it wasn't very safe to go wandering around the countryside. But my mother borrowed a pair of pliers from the bootmaker and cut through the wire fence around the camp, and she and my baby brother and myself, together with her uncle and aunt and their daughter, we escaped in the morning, early, about 8 o'clock. And I believe around 11 a.m. that same day, the SS came, rounded everyone up. Those who were too old or weak or sick to make the journey, they shot. The rest they marched to Mauthausen for extermination. But we wandered around the countryside with various adventures of different types, and ended up getting back to Budapest, to my grandmother and grandfather's place there. Then after we'd been there for a little while, Mum took us back to Sobotka, where she heard on the grapevine somewhere that my father had survived and would be back, and sometime later he did come back, and he wasn't very well. I think it took about 6 months before he was well enough to work, and then he wound up the cement products factory and sold it, and we all went back to Budapest. Now, I believe, I don't think you can see this in the video, but if you look over at those pictures and that one on the wall there, that little portrait up there, I think those actually came from my uncle and aunt's place in Sobotka, or great uncle and aunt. Now, I said that my father had married my mother, who was actually his cousin, and her brother had married my father's sister. And I said that her brother had perished in the satellite camp of Mauthausen. Now, apparently before they'd been deported, my father and his cousin and brother-in-law had agreed that should one of them perish and the other survive, the surviving one would look after the wife, the widow of whoever was left. It was their sister anyway in either case. And Dad did look after his sister, my Aunt Lily, and my uncle had, I believe, run I think it was a business manufacturing polishes or something like that. I can remember it because my father sort of wound it up and sold it, which was by the grace of God, because it was not, of course, Hungary had been liberated by the Russians, and that's why Hungary became an Iron Curtain country after the war. And so it wasn't that long before the Russians nationalised everything, but Dad had sold the business by then, and we looked to emigrate. And you know, you hear these stories about these boat people, and I've heard stories from people in the Navy and so on who actually intercept these boats, and they're saying these people aren't poor, they've got lots of gold jewellery and all that sort of stuff. And I think what's happened is that these people, in desiring to get to a better world, sort of collect all their valuables, pay through the nose to get somewhere, and then end up being taken advantage of by these unscrupulous people who run the illegal boats and so on. And I sympathise with those, because I think we had some things happen that were pretty similar. I think Mum and Dad paid $1,000, which was a lot of money in those days, to somebody in South America who was going to organise for us to go there. Don't ask me where in South America, I've got no idea. They paid the money but never heard anything more. Now, my father's cousin had been taken as a child by his father to America. They lived in New York. And my mother's older brother's school friend had migrated to Australia before the war. And so they were prepared to sponsor us for visas. Everybody kind of wanted to get out of there. A lot of, some of the family members, Dad's two youngest sisters and their husbands and families went to Casablanca in Morocco, where in fact my paternal grandfather and grandmother are buried there. But I think they got out of Morocco and went to Spain and Switzerland after the French got out of Morocco. And so they were in Casablanca, but either Australia or New York, which place we went to, was going to depend on which visa came through first. And I remember Dad sitting my brother Paul and myself on his knee and telling us about these wonderful buildings in New York that were so tall that they called them skyscrapers. And anyway, the Australian visa came through first. And that's a bit of a saga because I don't know why. We were going to fly to Australia from Paris, fly to Sydney. Of course, an air trip in those days was about a 4-day trip in propeller-driven airliners. And we got on the train at Budapest to go to Paris, which we did. And we got to Paris, and again, the airline tickets had been paid for, and my mother or father or someone went to the travel agent to pick them up, and they all looked blank and there were no tickets. So we stayed in Paris for a few days, and then we were given a ticket on a luxury liner called the Derna, D-E-R-N-A, which in fact was a dreadful ship, quite small, only about 5,000 tonnes, I think. One of the other children on that voyage, Diana Armstrong, or she's now Armstrong, she's a year or two older than I am. She grew up in Australia and became a journalist and an author, and has written a book, which is just up there, called The Voyage of Their Life, and which tells the stories of several of the people who were on that ship, ours is included, and also tells the story of the whole voyage, which was a bit of a horror voyage. We departed Marseille, I think it was sometime in August or the first few days of September of 1948, and arrived in Melbourne on, I think, the 5th of November. The 5th of November was a Friday, but obviously the first Friday in November, and the preceding Tuesday had been the Melbourne Cup. Now, we didn't know anything about this, but Dad wondered what on earth was going on, because Melbourne was meant to be a big city, and all the streets were quiet, the traffic was dead, there was nothing going on. He didn't know what was going on. What a strange thing that the second biggest city in Australia should be so deadly quiet. And we had difficulty. We arrived there, and we were going to go on the train to Sydney the next day, so we had to find overnight accommodation. And they had a great deal of difficulty finding overnight accommodation, for as I can remember. And everybody said, oh no, we're all booked up because it's a Melbourne Cup. Now, you and I know what the Melbourne Cup is, but to them, with their very limited English, a cup was something you drink out of. So what a Melbourne Cup was, who knows, and why that should stop you getting accommodation, it was all a mystery. But anyway, we got on the train, the famous, or then famous, Spirit of Progress, to Sydney, but much to my parents' distress, we had to get out in the middle of the night and change trains at Albury, because in those days Victoria had the broad gauge railways, New South Wales had standard gauge, and so you had to change trains at Albury. These days it's standard gauge all the way through. Anyway, we got up there, we went to Canley Vale. We spent about 6 weeks with my mother's brother's friend, and they had a little farm at Canley Vale. Now it's all built out. It's all sort of, it's now inner western suburbs, I think, but in those days it was way out the sticks, and they had an acre or 2 or 3, I can't remember, but I can remember they had ducks and geese and chickens and stuff like that. The geese wandered around and terrorised everyone. Anyway, we found a cottage in Chatswood, to rent, and eventually bought it, 16 Tessa Street, Chatswood. Just going back a bit, I'm not sure quite at what time, because I was only knee-high to a grasshopper, but my mother had decided to become a Christian, which was culturally very much a no-no for a Jewish person, and not without reason, unfortunately. Whether it was her rebellious nature, because I can assure you she was certainly rebellious in her nature, or what, I don't know. I've heard some story, I don't know if she told it, that Jesus appeared to her in the camp and assured her that we would survive and get out of this and be all right. It's probably true. But at any rate, I'm not quite sure just what the progress was at that point while I was so little. I think at one point she went to a Catholic priest and said she wanted to convert, but he was rather off-putting, saying, you know, took a lot of time and lessons and everything else before you could convert. I don't know where all that went, but for some reason she said we were actually Presbyterian. But we lived in Chatswood there in Tessa Street, which is not that far from the western side of the Pacific Highway. The Presbyterian church, I'm not even sure where it was or is, but it was on the other side of the Pacific Highway, and my mother didn't want us to have to be crossing the main road, and us little kids. So St Paul's Church was only a few hundred yards, St Paul's Anglican Church on the corner of Fuller's Road and View Street. It was only a few hundred yards from our place, and so we went there. So I was brought up in the Sunday school at St Paul's Anglican Church in Chatswood. The church is still there. The church that we went to subsequently became the church hall when they built the current rather nice stone church. I can remember it being built. And we're talking Anglican Church, Sydney Anglican Church here, which is Sydney Anglican Church, was low church and quite evangelical in its outlook and ethos and beliefs. And so I grew up in the Sunday school there, which was run by, there was a firm of builders called Girvan Brothers, and the two Girvan brothers who ran this firm actually ran the Sunday school there, and they did a wonderful job. They're lovely people. And so we were very well brought up and educated in the Christian church there, and that really, I suppose I was 7 years old, well, probably under 7 when we first started to go there. And if you talk with God, walk with God, you realise He's very real. So He has actually been very real to me all my life, ever since I was first went there. We later moved house in 1955. We moved house to a place at East Roseville, and the nearest Anglican church there was St Barnabas at Roseville East, which is where I continued on in the Sunday school, and then got old enough to go to junior fellowship and get confirmed, and subsequently got married there actually. When it was time to finish school and go off to university, I had no idea what was happening to me, but I got dragged by my little pink shell-like off to a thing called EU, Evangelical Union, which was very good, and it continued my Christian education. So I went to university to go to EU and did medicine on the side. But that was good. They gave us courses in group leadership, and I remember we not associated with EU, but associated with a friend of mine whose father was a very senior clergyman and highly respected. We did some sort of correspondence Bible course, and he invigilated the exam. I can remember that. Towards the end of that time, I met Heather and we got married. As I finished medicine, what normally happens is that, well, these days they call it an intern year. You have to spend 1 year working as a junior doctor in a hospital before you can be a registered medical practitioner. When you get your medical qualifications, you get what's called provisional registration, and you can, these days it's called an intern year. In those days we called it a junior residency, same thing. What most people did was apply for this, that, or the other hospital in Sydney and New South Wales. But in those days, Tasmania had no medical school, and so they sourced their junior doctors from all over. The medical superintendents of all the Tasmanian hospitals went around and gave little talks to final year medical students, and in fact they even recruited some from overseas, two from Scotland. But one of the attractions of that was married quarters, because it was kind of a matter of pride to work fairly long hours. As a junior resident, I think we expected to work something like 90 hours a week, which we did. And you got paid a pittance. These days the junior staff work very reasonable hours and get paid reasonably. And in all honesty, it may not have been the good old days, but I think today's system is better. In my day, your training was a prelude to your career. I mean, your postgraduate training. In these days, the postgraduate training is a part of your career because it takes a lot longer, but the conditions are much better. At any rate, I ended up as a junior resident in Launceston General Hospital, which was good experience, and we loved Tasmania, where we spent the year. At the end of the year, I thought, well, I was a city boy born and bred, and I wondered if I wouldn't like the country. So I thought, well, that's the advantage of being a junior doctor. You can go and work wherever you want and try it out. So I ended up as a second-year resident at the Albury Base Hospital. Our oldest boy, who's there in that photograph with Heather and the dog, he was born in Albury. Then that year came to a close, and I wondered what I wanted to do. I realised after I'd, as a junior doctor there, I'd delivered a baby, which was not unusual. That's what we were doing all the time, among other things. But I found that I felt so good about doing that. I thought, well, this is what I want to do. And fortunately, I was able to get a position at as a junior at the Women's Hospital at Crown Street. That's now closed. They closed it when they opened Westmead. But it was one of the world's major teaching hospitals. So I spent 6 months there, went to the UK, where, well, all of us in those days who specialised, virtually everybody who specialised went to the UK for experience and to gain the letters after your name. We came back to Australia. I worked in Albury for a while and Wodonga, and then went to the Hawkesbury, to Windsor, or just outside Windsor. We lived there for 19 and a half years, but that really was too much hard work for not enough return. So I took a staff specialist position in the Townsville Hospital. That was the best thing I'd ever done. It was brilliant. We had a wonderful time up there. When I got to the age that I didn't want to work full-time anymore, we moved down here to Bribie Island. And for 6 years or so, I did locums, which means I was filling in for other doctors who were on holidays. So instead of having to buy a caravan and travel all over Australia like other grey nomads, I was paid to work all over Australia and saw the country. It was marvellous. But just going back a little to the Hawkesbury, to Windsor, again I was going to the church there. The church in Albury was St Matthew's Church. The church in Windsor was St Matthew's Church. St Matthew's seems to have had quite a few churches. Anyway, the rector at St Matthew's Church seemed to be really terrific. He was great. And I ended up on parish council. In fact, I was on parish council in Albury as well. And in fact, rector's warden at Albury, but I was just on parish council at St Matthew's. And this rector, who had been just so good, went to water. There was a new development, housing development, and I said, look, here it is, right here, just a stone's throw from the church. We should be going there and door knocking and inviting people to church and this sort of thing. And they didn't want to have a bar of it. And I felt more and more uncomfortable there. But in the meantime, there's a chap called Ian Woods who had started an AOG church in Windsor called the Hawkesbury Christian Centre, and he had shown an interest in some of the outreach things Heather and I were doing. And so when I said, no, we're not going to go to St Matthew's anymore, it's just, I just don't feel comfortable there. Oh yeah, what happened was that I was on parish council and I was trying to say we should do this outreach. So after a lot of pushing that way, they said, oh yes, okay, we'll have an outreach committee. When there's something you don't want to do, you have a committee. And the next thing that happened was that I wasn't elected back to parish council, and I just felt more and more uncomfortable. And so we thought, okay, Ian Woods has shown this interest in what we're doing and given us support. Let's go to his church. And God sometimes has to prize us out of the positions in which we're comfortable, because it's better to go somewhere else. I had grown up in the Anglican Church. I had got to know God in the Anglican Church. I'd been educated in my Christian life in the Anglican Church and the Evangelical Union. So I had to wait until I was really, really, really uncomfortable before I thought, well, we better try something else. The best thing we ever did, it was a quantum leap in my spiritual growth. I realised everything that Ian was talking about was totally biblical with regard to the gifts of the Spirit and things like that, talking in tongues. And it was a very active church. Everything that a church should be doing, they were doing. It was really good. And Ian and his wife, Joan, became very good friends. Ian, who was several years younger than myself, unfortunately passed away about 2 or 3 years ago from prostate cancer. But Joan is still a very good friend. Heather talks with her on the phone just about every day. and we're good friends. We remained friends, and we really grew. And then we left that church after 6 years because we went up to Townsville, and we joined a big church there, Calvary, which again was a very big church, about 1,000 people there of a Sunday. But they were very alive, very active. And then we came down to Bribie and kept going to church down here, ended up going to Connect Church, but that became just too far away, and so we're now online members of a very, very spirit-filled church in Sydney, but we've got to know a lot of these people on Zoom meetings. The one benefit of the pandemic and the lockdowns was the development of Zoom meetings, and so we really get to know people who are Melbourne, rural New South Wales, Sydney, overseas. The truth is that I would not have made it if God hadn't been with me every day. As I said, when we first got sent to Sunday school, we were brought up very well. The only Bible that most people had in those days was the King James Version, the authorised version. And while that's a very good version and very dear to a lot of people, especially then, not so much now maybe, but it was rather incomprehensible to a little school kid, particularly struggling to learn English. And because of its archaic language, I think what we got taught in Sunday school was that they taught us the Bible stories. They taught us about Joseph and his coat of many colours, about Pharaoh and Moses, about the Exodus, about Joshua, about Samuel, about David. All those stories were stories of Jesus and his parables and all the rest of it. That they taught us as Bible stories, and that was really good. And then it really made a difference later when I was in the Evangelical Union, was when I was taught about regular Bible reading, and that's the first time that I ever read through the Bible from go to woe, and I've done it a couple of times since. But those were the major things. And of course, as I say, I had grown up with God as a very real person and walking with him, and he was ever present. But despite that, when we joined the Pentecostal movement, it was an absolute quantum leap forward. I realised that although the Evangelical Union and the Anglican Church today might be here, there or anywhere, but if you look at what it's based on, which is the 39 Articles, totally Bible-based. And so everything that I'd been brought up in was totally Bible-based. And yet when we went to the Pentecostal church, I realised that they were leaving half of it out. There was I had been taught, and quite correctly, that whatever people say, does it correspond with what the Bible says? And everything that they taught us, you look, it's all there in the Bible, the book of Acts and lots of other places as well. So as far as God having to prize us out of places we're comfortable, I loved our few acres in Windsor, just outside Windsor in the Hawkesbury there. That's why I stayed as long as I did in a work situation that was very unsatisfactory, because I thought I've just got to work at it and keep at it and see if I can't make it satisfactory, because I really loved living there, and I wanted to live there. And I can remember just begging God, not asking him, begging him to let me stay there. And then it became obvious that we just couldn't. So we went up to Townsville, best thing we ever did. It is academically, professionally. I was on the staff of a tertiary level teaching hospital. I had an appointment as senior lecturer at the Northern Clinical School of the University of Queensland, which changed to, not the university changed, but we changed our allegiance to James Cook University when James Cook University got a medical course going. And that's what I retired from. When I say that was a full-time work, but it was absolutely wonderful running around all, working in Darwin or Port Hedland or Perth or even at Caboolture. I was working full-time at Caboolture for several months at a time on a couple of occasions, which was convenient, and I could live at home, but it's quite fascinating to, say spend a month at Alice Springs, things like that. It took me a while to speak in tongues. It was obvious that people were getting a lot out of it. I had been told, and I think this is true, and I don't quite know why, I think it's a spiritual thing, but I'd been told that people with a tertiary level education often had some difficulty in being baptised in the Holy Spirit, as we call it, which was marked by speaking in tongues. But it was obvious to me that it was a very good thing to do. And I mean, the Apostle Paul himself said, I speak in tongues more than any of you. So this is what I mean by it being totally biblical and yet neglected by the majority of evangelical churches. And it was a struggle, but I got there. There were other miracles that happened. Often miracles are very small things that you don't realise. Mundane things. But God's faithful to us, and he does those little things just to give us a pat on the back to let us know he's there. Just the other day out in my workshop there, I dropped something. I couldn't find it. I thought, oh, what the heck? So I carried on. The next day, I dropped something else, and when I bent down to pick it up, there was the first thing I'd dropped. I'd been looking for it, I couldn't find it, but I said, there it is. And I think it's important to recognise in our everyday life that that's happening. It's not coincidence. It's not, oh, good, It's little things like that happen all the time. And of course, he who's faithful in little is also going to be faithful in much. When we were at Albury, the rector there, who again we were quite good friends with, and I ended up being on parish council and rector's warden there, he became interested. This is going back to the early to mid-70s, and he had become interested in the Pentecostal movement, and he had a visiting minister who was heavily into healing ministry. And my wife, Heather, suddenly started to get these migraine headaches. Now, nobody likes a migraine. Migraines are never good. But hers were absolutely incapacitating. And I mean absolutely incapacitating. she was in considerable pain and discomfort. The only thing she could do was lie on the bed in the darkened bedroom with a wet face cloth over her and lie there, but she couldn't do anything else. I was working in a medical practice. We had 2 little kids, and she was not only out of action but in agony with it. And of course we sought medical treatment, and she was given all the proper treatments that were known at the time. None of it helped. Then Heather got prayed for, and that was the end of the migraines. And when the devil brings these things, he's not always keen to get out. And what happened was that Heather would know when a migraine was coming on, and she'd ring up the rector, who, as I say, was also a friend, and say that he'd pray with her on the phone, and that was the end of that. And then not long after, we went to the Hawkesbury Christian Centre when I was at Windsor there. Not long after, so when I was still just new to all this thing of not just speaking in tongues, but word of knowledge and much more active healing ministry and so on, I got a tennis elbow. Now, I'd had a tennis elbow before in my right arm, which I knew what it was from. I'd been hammering in something with a heavy hammer, and it was a bit of a nuisance, and my orthopaedic surgeon friend gave me an injection into it, which was meant to hurt, but it didn't, and it fixed it, no problem. But I got this tennis elbow on the left, and I have no idea why I got it. It just came out of the blue. And it was bad. It was getting so bad that it was starting to interfere with me when I operated. I was finding difficulty in holding the instruments. The pain was so bad that it was waking me up at night. My orthopaedic surgeon friend gave me another injection into it, which, as I say, they're meant to hurt. Believe me, it did. It hurt. Did it help? No. After this is very soon after we'd started to go to the Hawkesbury Christian Centre, and Ian after the service, I said to Ian, "Look, would you pray for my elbow? I've got this tennis elbow, and it's really bad. It's interfering with my work. It's waking me at night." And I can still remember, because he said, "Which elbow?" And I can remember the naughty thought that went through my mind, seeing as how we were just learning about word of knowledge and this sort of stuff. I thought, "You ought to know." I didn't say that, though. I said the left one. So he prayed for it. And he said, "How's that feeling? Any different?" I said, "No, not really." And he looked a bit crestfallen. Anyway, we went to church next Sunday. And when we were at church the next Sunday, I realised that from the time he had prayed for it, it had actually started to get better. So although I didn't feel an immediate thing like that, during that week it had not woken me up at night once, whereas before the pain had woken me up 2 or 3 times of a night. It had not woken me up once, and by the time a week or 2 had gone, it was totally good, and I've never had a twinge of pain from it ever since. So, you learn these things are for real. That God is real. He's with you every minute of every day. You're not alone. You're never alone. And you'd never feel alone. And you also know that there's nothing that's going to happen that's going to be more than you can take. And that's what it tells us in the Bible, and it's true. It doesn't say life's going to be a bed of roses, but it does mean that as you walk through life, you're not walking through it alone. And, people talk about going to heaven when you die, and I'm sure that's true. But what I mean by that is that I think it's better than that. I think to a limited extent, I think we're limited by our world, our physical world, but what it's all about, what the whole thing is about really, is that when God created Adam and Eve, he created us to be in fellowship with him. When the choice was made and the fruit was eaten, that separated us from him. And what heaven really is, more so than a place, is that restoration of that relationship. I'm not saying unscriptural things about whether or not heaven really is a place. Of course it is. But the real thing is that our relationship with God has been restored. And when you consider who God is, when you consider what God has been done, what God has done, I mean, that really gives the word awesome meaning. To know that we just have fellowship with him, and really that's what it's all about. That God is real. He's with you every minute of every day. You're not alone. You're never alone. And you never feel alone. And you also know that there's nothing that's going to happen that's going to be more than you can take. And that's what it tells us in the Bible, and it's true. It doesn't say life's going to be a bed of roses, but it does mean that as you walk through life, you're not walking through it alone. And, people talk about going to heaven when you die, and I'm sure that's true. But what I mean by that is that I think it's better than that. I think to a limited extent, I think we're limited by our world, our physical world, but what it's all about, what the whole thing is about really, is that when God created Adam and Eve, he created us to be in fellowship with him. When the choice was made and the fruit was eaten, that separated us from him. And what heaven really is, more so than a place, is that restoration of that relationship. I'm not saying unscriptural things about whether or not heaven really is a place. Of course it is. But the real thing is that our relationship with God has been restored. And when you consider who God is, when you consider what God has been done, what God has done, I mean, that really gives the word awesome meaning. To know that we just have fellowship with him, and really that's what it's all about.